The woods around Lecture Hollow don't breathe like other woods. They hum, low, constant, and alive with secrets too old to belong to this century. Locals say the wind there carries voices, though no one listens long enough to tell what they're saying. A single road cuts through the hollow, a ribbon of cracked asphalt leading nowhere but deeper into silence. It was down that road that Clara Hayes drove one wet November afternoon, following the return address of an unsigned letter that had arrived at her newspaper desk 3 days earlier. The letter had no signature, no date, just 6 words scrawled in trembling ink: "He shared his wife with blood." The rain had stopped by the time she reached the tree line, but the air felt thick, swollen with the scent of moss and rot. The cabin was easy to miss, half swallowed by ivy and leaning against itself like a drunk too tired to stand. Inside, the floorboards bowed inward, the smell of something long dead lingering in the dust. Her flashlight flickered across the walls, names scratched into the wood, initials crossed out, rewritten, then crossed again. It was a house that had tried to erase itself and failed. In one corner, she found a photograph sealed in a cracked frame: a man with pale eyes, a woman with a hollow smile, and a boy standing too close between them. Their faces seemed to share the same expression, something quiet and broken. The back of the photo was marked with a year, 1952. She didn't know it yet, but that was the year the sheriff stopped coming to Lecture Hollow, the year no one spoke of again. When the wind shifted that night, Clara thought she heard laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that pressed against her chest, as if the woods themselves were remembering something awful and wanted her to remember it too. It began with a letter that shouldn't have existed, the kind that arrives without return, without a name, and yet somehow knows exactly where to find you. Clara Hayes had been working late in the Louisville newsroom when it appeared on her desk, a plain, weathered envelope, the paper soft with age, the edges yellowed as if it had been handled too many times by trembling fingers. There was no postage, no address, just her name typed unevenly across the front. Inside was a single page, lined but stained, with one sentence written in ink that had begun to fade: *, there's a family buried alive by its own sins deep in the woods of Lecture Hollow. * beneath that, barely legible, someone had drawn what looked like the outline of a cabin surrounded by trees. Clara didn't know why the words unsettled her so much. She'd covered dozens of stories, missing persons, cold cases, Appalachian ghost towns that never made it into the digital archives, but something about this one felt personal, as if whoever wrote it knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it. She showed the letter to her editor, who laughed it off, calling it another backwoods ghost tale. But that night, as she sat alone in her apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about the phrase * buried alive by its own sins. * the wording wasn't poetic, it was a confession. She searched for the name Lecture Hollow online and found almost nothing. The only reference was an abandoned mining settlement in eastern Kentucky, wiped from official records after a flood in the 1970s. No photos, no census data, no history. It was as if the place had been erased on purpose. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. The same phrase from the letter appeared scribbled in pencil on her car windshield one morning, and an anonymous call came through her office line that afternoon, only the sound of breathing on the other end. The caller hung up when she said hello. It was enough to convince her that the letter wasn't a prank. Someone wanted her to go there. Someone wanted her to find something that had been hidden for decades. By the end of the week, Clara had packed her camera, notebook, and recorder. She printed a map of eastern Kentucky and drew a red circle where Lecture Hollow should have been. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even her editor. As she locked her apartment door behind her, a storm rolled over the city, dark and heavy, and for the first time, she felt a pull toward the unknown, not the curiosity of a journalist chasing a lead, but the quiet dread of someone answering a call that was never meant for the living. The drive to Lecture Hollow took longer than Clara expected, not because of the distance, but because of how the road seemed to resist her arrival. The farther she went into eastern Kentucky, the more the map stopped making sense. GPS flickered, the signal cut out, and hand-painted signs pointed in conflicting directions. The asphalt narrowed into gravel, and gravel became dirt, until she was surrounded by endless green walls of pine and oak pressing in on both sides. It was late afternoon when she saw the rusted sign half hidden in vines, *welcome to Lecture Hollow *, the paint almost eaten away by time. The silence that followed was unnatural, a quiet so heavy it seemed to swallow the hum of her engine. She rolled down her window, expecting to hear birds or the rustle of leaves, but there was only the faint creak of trees shifting in the wind. The town was smaller than she imagined. A few houses still stood, their windows boarded, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. A single gas station sat at the edge of a dry creek, its pumps long out of service. She parked near what must have once been the main street, though it looked more like a graveyard of forgotten lives, rusted mailboxes, children's shoes scattered in the dirt, a bicycle frame twisted into the weeds. When she stepped out of the car, the air felt wrong, too thick, like it hadn't been stirred in years. A man sitting on the porch of the only building that looked remotely occupied, a general store with a flickering open sign, watched her without speaking. His skin was weathered like bark, his eyes pale and wary. Clara approached him, offering a polite nod before asking if he'd heard of the Caldwells. The man's expression hardened instantly. He spat into the dust and muttered, "Ain't nothing up there worth finding." She pressed again, mentioning the letter she received, but he turned his gaze away, staring at the tree line as if afraid something might be listening. "We don't talk about that family," he said. "Best turn around before the dark catches you." The way he said the dark asterisk made her stomach tighten. She thanked him and stepped back, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on her as she returned to her car. More people had gathered silently in doorways and windows, watching her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. None of them spoke, but their faces told her everything. Whatever had happened here was not forgotten, only buried under fear. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, she drove slowly toward the woods, following a narrow path that the man had warned her not to take. In her rearview mirror, the town of Letcher Hollow disappeared behind her, swallowed whole by the shadows that waited for her ahead. The dirt road that led into the woods was nearly invisible beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. Branches reached over it like fingers, and the deeper Clara drove, the dimmer the daylight became until it felt like dusk had arrived hours early. The trees seemed older here, their roots twisting through the soil like veins, their trunks marked with strange carvings she couldn't decipher. When the road finally ended, she saw it, the remnants of the Caldwell cabin, slumped against the forest floor as though the earth itself had grown tired of holding it up. The roof had caved in, and the chimney leaned at an angle, but the outline of the home was still visible, frozen in decay. A faint smell of damp rot and iron hung in the air, mingling with something sweeter, almost like decaying flowers. She parked a few yards away, heart thudding, and stepped out into the silence that followed her everywhere since entering Letcher Hollow. The cabin's door had long since fallen, lying half-buried in moss. When Clara ducked inside, her flashlight beam sliced through dust motes that hung like suspended ash. The wooden floor creaked beneath her boots, each step stirring up the ghost of what this place once was. There were signs of life scattered among the ruins, a rusted kettle, a rocking chair missing a leg, and on the wall, a faded family Bible nailed open, its pages stuck together with moisture and time. She touched it carefully, and the paper flaked beneath her fingertips. The ink had bled, but she could still make out names written in shaky cursive, Eli Caldwell, Mary Caldwell, Jacob Caldwell. Beneath them were dates of birth and death, but the last entry had been scratched out so violently that the page was torn through. Someone had wanted to erase something, someone. A shiver crawled up her spine as her flashlight caught the glint of something near the fireplace. She knelt and brushed away a layer of dirt, revealing small bones, animal, she thought at first, then noticed the unnatural arrangement. They had been placed deliberately in a circle, each bone pointing inward. Her breathing quickened. Behind her, a floorboard groaned, though she hadn't moved. She spun around, the light sweeping across the rotting beams and the broken window that framed the woods outside. Nothing. Only trees swaying slightly in a wind she couldn't feel. Before leaving, she took a photograph of the Bible and the strange circle of bones. As she turned toward the door, she noticed faint symbols carved into the doorway, crosses overlapping triangles, their edges scorched black. The carvings looked like protection marks, the kind used to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. Clara stepped outside, but as she looked back at the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had moved closer, as if the forest itself was inching forward, curious to see who had come to disturb the grave of the Caldwells. Clara drove back into town the next morning with the photograph of the Bible still fresh in her mind. The pale dawn light made Lecture Hollow look less menacing, but only on the surface. The streets were just as empty, the same people standing on porches, watching her without expression. She parked near the old courthouse, a red brick building whose clock had stopped at 3:17 decades ago. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and forgotten paper. A single fan spun lazily from the ceiling as the town clerk, an elderly woman named Martha Keene, shuffled through dusty filing cabinets. When Clara mentioned the Caldwell family, Martha's hands froze mid-motion. For a long time, she didn't look up. Then she sighed, the sound heavy and tired, as if she had been waiting years for someone to ask that name again. They were trouble, Martha said quietly. Not the kind you read about in newspapers, the kind that grows inside walls. She pulled out an old leather-bound register and opened it on the desk. Faded ink revealed births, deaths, and property records. The Caldwell name appeared again and again, spanning nearly a century. Eli Caldwell had owned hundreds of acres of woodland and ruled his household with an authority that bordered on worship. The town had depended on him once. He provided lumber, hired laborers, and gave food during the harsh winters, but in return, he demanded loyalty and silence. Rumors began when his wife, Mary, stopped appearing at church. People whispered that she had taken ill, but others claimed they saw her near the cabin long after she was said to be bedridden. What no one dared to speak openly about was Eli's obsession with his own bloodline. Martha's voice dropped to a near whisper as she told Clara that Eli had forced his eldest son, Jacob, to take his mother's vows. He claimed it was a divine act, something about keeping their lineage pure and untainted by outsiders. The preacher had left town soon after confronting him, and the sheriff stopped visiting their land altogether. They lived out there like animals after that, Martha said, eyes fixed on the records. When Mary disappeared, people didn't ask questions. They were afraid of what they might find if they did. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft creeping through the broken window. The records ended abruptly in 1952, the same year written on the back of the photograph she found in the cabin. When Clara asked what became of Jacob, Martha closed the register and shook her head. Some say he went mad. Others say his father buried him out there with her. Then she looked up, her voice trembling slightly. But if you found that cabin still standing, miss, then maybe not everyone stayed buried. Clara left the courthouse with the unsettling feeling that she wasn't uncovering a story, but awakening something that had been waiting for her to arrive. The photograph had been tucked behind the torn pages of an old ledger Martha had shown her before leaving the courthouse. It wasn't listed among the official records, as if someone had tried to keep it from ever being seen. Clara slipped it carefully into her notebook, but she couldn't stop staring at it even as she sat in her car with the engine off. The picture was small and sepia-toned, probably taken sometime in the early 1950s. 3 figures stood in front of the cabin she had found the day before, the same warped structure now half-eaten by moss and time. The man Eli Caldwell, she assumed, had a wide, square jaw and eyes that caught the light strangely, almost reflective. Beside him stood a woman whose beauty was faded even in the photograph, her posture rigid, her mouth twisted into what might have been a smile but looked more like submission. Between them stood a boy, maybe 17 or 18, tall, thin, and disturbingly close to his mother. His hand rested on her waist, and her fingers curled around his as though she wasn't sure whether to hold on or let go. There was something deeply unsettling about their closeness, something that reached beyond the photograph's age. Clara had seen enough family portraits from rural America to know the difference between intimacy and something else entirely. Their expressions didn't convey warmth or love, they shared the same tight, hollow stare, as if all 3 were aware of something unspeakable pressing in from behind the lens. On the back of the photo, written in faint pencil, was a single year, *1952. Beneath it, someone had drawn a small cross. She zoomed in with her phone's camera to study the image more closely. The cabin door behind them bore the same strange carvings she'd noticed during her visit, crosses overlapping triangles. There was also something new she hadn't seen before, barely visible in the background, a 4th shadow near the window. It was faint, misshapen, and too tall to be a child. The longer she stared, the more it seemed like someone or something was standing just inside, watching them as the photograph was taken. Clara's pulse quickened as the wind picked up outside her car, rattling the branches overhead. The photograph suddenly felt heavier in her hands, as though it carried more than just an image. It held the residue of something that refused to fade. When she returned to the cabin later that day to compare the carvings, the air felt colder, sharper. The same window from the photo stood shattered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement inside. But when she looked again, there was nothing there, only the echo of 3 faces from a photograph that seemed far too alive for its age. That night, Clara checked into the only place in town that still took guests, a rundown inn on the edge of Lecture Hollow, its neon vacancy sign buzzing weakly against the dark. The clerk barely spoke as she handed over a tarnished key, and the hallway smelled faintly of mildew and cold wood. Her room was small, furnished with a narrow bed and a window that looked straight into the black outline of the woods. She spread her notes and the photograph across the desk, replaying the day in her head, the cabin's carvings, Martha's warnings, the strange shadow behind the family in the picture. As the clock crept past midnight, she realized how heavy the silence had become. Not the ordinary quiet of an isolated town, but something layered, almost listening. At first, it was just the soft tapping of tree branches against the window. But as she turned off the lamp and lay down, the sound changed. It was slower, deliberate, like footsteps pacing the hall outside her door. Clara froze. The floorboards creaked once, then again, moving closer. She sat up, heart thudding, eyes fixed on the thin strip of light under the door. A shadow paused there for a moment, long enough for her breath to catch, before retreating down the hall. When she finally opened the door, there was nothing, just the smell of damp air and the faint echo of footsteps fading away. She tried to sleep but couldn't. The wind outside carried a faint whisper, a rhythm that almost formed words. Every so often, she thought she heard laughter, soft, distant, and childlike. It came from the direction of the woods, rising and falling like something playing just beyond the edge of hearing. She pressed her ear to the glass, but the forest remained still. Yet, when she turned away, the laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a single, low sound that might have been a sigh or a moan. The next morning, she asked the clerk if anyone else was staying in the inn. The woman shook her head, eyes downcast, saying she hadn't rented another room in weeks. Clara didn't mention the footsteps or the whispers, but she noticed how the clerk's hand trembled slightly as she handed over the receipt. "You're best not staying another night," she murmured, almost to herself. "Them woods remember what they lost." Clara drove out to the cabin again that afternoon, trying to shake the memory of that voice in the dark. But as she stepped from the car, the same eerie stillness surrounded her, as if the forest had been waiting for her return. The air felt charged, alive with a quiet that pulsed beneath her skin. Somewhere among the trees, something was awake, and it knew she was there. The deeper Clara dug into the Caldwell story, the more she realized how carefully the truth had been buried. Official records ended abruptly, with no mention of Mary Caldwell's death or disappearance. There were no obituaries, no police reports, not even a grave marker. It was as though she had been erased from existence. Clara drove to the sheriff's office in the next county over, where the archives from Lecture Hollow's jurisdiction had supposedly been transferred decades ago. The office was small and dimly lit, its walls lined with filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. The deputy on duty, a heavy-set man with a tired face, barely looked up when she explained what she was researching. But when she said the name *Caldwell, his posture stiffened. He leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing as though she had said a curse. After a long pause, he disappeared into a back room and returned with a thin, dust-covered folder. Inside were a few handwritten notes, photographs of the cabin from the early 50s, and a brief report written in faded blue ink. The last entry, dated September 1952, read simply, *case closed by order of Sheriff M. Tully. No foul play found. There were no statements, no follow-up reports, nothing to explain why the file ended so abruptly. Clara pointed this out, but the deputy only shrugged, saying, "That's how it's always been." When she pressed for details about Mary, he hesitated, lowering his voice. "Sheriff Tully said she left," he muttered. "Packed a bag, disappeared one night. But folks around here don't believe that. Not after what went on in that house." He wouldn't say more, but as Clara turned to leave, he stopped her. "You want my advice," he said. "Don't go looking for a woman who didn't want to be found." His words carried a strange weight, a warning that sounded more like guilt than concern. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Clara sat in her car, staring at the folder in her hands, thinking about the sheriff who had closed the case. She wondered what could make a man decide to erase an entire family's tragedy from record. That night, back at the inn, she spread the file across the bed. The photographs showed the cabin in its early decay, but in one image, she noticed something chilling: a woman's figure barely visible through the cabin window, her face blurred as if moving mid-shot. It wasn't the kind of detail a camera from the 1950s could easily capture, yet there she was, caught between the living and the forgotten. Clara's breath slowed as she realized what it meant. Maybe Mary hadn't left at all. Maybe the sheriff hadn't closed a case. Maybe he had sealed a secret that the woods of Letcher Hollow never intended to let die. Clara found the former deputy 2 days later, living in a small trailer park a few miles outside the hollow. His name was Roy Danner, and according to the records she'd seen, he had served under Sheriff Tully during the final years before the Caldwell case was closed. The trailer was surrounded by junked cars and tall weeds, and the air smelled faintly of oil and rust. When she introduced herself and mentioned the Caldwells, Roy froze halfway through lighting a cigarette. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her as if she'd spoken the name of something long dead but still dangerous. Then, with a shaky sigh, he gestured toward a folding chair and told her to sit. At first, Roy spoke in short, clipped sentences, the kind of talk that came from someone carrying too many years of silence. But the longer Clara stayed, the more the details began to slip out. He admitted that Eli Caldwell wasn't just a patriarch, he was a man who saw himself as a prophet. He ran his family like a cult, teaching that blood was sacred, that love and purity were one and the same. Everyone in the house, Roy said, lived under his rules, and those who disobeyed disappeared. When Mary Caldwell grew sick, Eli claimed her illness was punishment from God, a sign that the family needed to renew the bond. That was when he forced Jacob, his eldest son, to marry her. Roy's voice trembled as he described the day the sheriff was called to the cabin. "We found her alive," he said, "but she wasn't herself. She had been sitting by the fire, staring at the wall, humming the same tune over and over. Jacob stood behind her, hands blooded, whispering something none of us could understand. Eli was calm, too calm. Said it was done, said the family was pure again." Roy took a long drag from his cigarette, eyes glassy. "The sheriff told us to walk away, told us not to write a damn thing. Said the family was private, that the Lord handled his own." Clara felt a chill run through her as Roy leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You think they were just living in that cabin? No, miss. They were sharing everything: food, beds, breath. He made them believe it was holy." Roy looked away then, his hand trembling as he crushed out his cigarette. "You want to find the truth, don't go looking in the courthouse or the papers. Go back to that house. The walls remember. They always do." Clara left the trailer in silence, the air around her thick with the echo of his words, and for the first time, she felt afraid not of what she might find but of what might already be waiting for her to come back. Clara returned to the cabin with Roy's words echoing in her mind, her footsteps slow and uncertain as the path narrowed beneath the weight of the woods. The sun was beginning to set, washing the forest in the dull glow of dying light. The cabin looked even smaller now, almost swallowed by the trees, as if nature had been trying for decades to hide what it couldn't erase. She pushed open what was left of the door and stepped inside, breathing in the same damp, metallic air that had greeted her the first time. Everything was as she'd left it: the broken furniture, the scorched carvings on the doorway, the circle of bones near the hearth, but there was something new. The floorboards behind the fireplace were slightly raised, uneven, as though someone had hidden something beneath. She knelt down and brushed away the dust, uncovering a wooden hatch half-rotted from moisture. It took all her strength to pry it open, the hinges groaning like an animal in pain. A wave of cold air rose from below, thick and stale. She shone her flashlight into the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase carved into the earth. The walls were lined with stones slick from condensation, and the air grew heavier with each step she took. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a root cellar that stretched farther than it should have, the ground uneven and damp. At first, it looked empty. Then the light caught something, chains bolted into the walls, rusted and broken, and beside them, small wooden toys scattered in the dirt. A doll missing an eye. A carved horse. A button from a child's coat. Her heart pounded as she moved deeper into the cellar. That was when she saw the wall. It wasn't made of stone like the others, it was wooden, covered in carvings. Names, dozens of them, etched into the surface with trembling hands. Some were familiar: Eli, Mary, Jacob, while others were smaller, written clumsily, the letters uneven, as if carved by children. Next to each name was a date. The earliest went back to the 1800s. The last was from 1952. But one name at the bottom caught her attention. It was fresher, carved deeper than the rest. The name read *Clara. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The air seemed to close around her, the beam of her flashlight trembling as she stepped back. Somewhere above her, the floor creaked, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind this time. Something was moving inside the cabin. She killed the light and held her breath, the silence thick enough to choke her. In the dark, she thought she could hear faint breathing, steady, human, and close. Too close. Clara ran from the cellar as fast as she could, clawing her way up the narrow staircase until her hands scraped against splintered wood. When she burst through the hatch, the cabin was almost completely dark, lit only by the thin thread of moonlight cutting through the cracks in the walls. She stood still, listening. The sound of breathing she'd heard below had stopped, but the silence above was even worse. Every board creaked under her feet as if the house itself were shifting. She aimed her flashlight toward the doorway, but the beam flickered and died, leaving her in the dim blue of the night. She could still see the faint outline of the Bible on the wall, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Then came a whisper, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Her name. *Clara. Drawn out slowly, almost lovingly, as if whoever said it was right behind her. She turned and saw nothing. The walls seemed to breathe, the air pulsing in and out with the rhythm of something alive. Panic clawed at her throat as she stumbled out of the cabin and into the woods, branches snapping beneath her boots. The forest, once still, now felt awake. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, stretching across the trees as if the night itself were chasing her. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, gasping, mud streaked across her hands. When she looked back, the cabin was gone. Not hidden by distance or trees, it was simply not there anymore, replaced by an empty clearing bathed in moonlight. The drive back to town was a blur, but when she arrived, everything felt wrong. The streets were darker than before, the houses empty, the neon sign of the inn flickering weakly. Inside, her notes and the photograph were spread across the desk just as she'd left them, but the faces in the photo had changed. The mother and son were still there, standing close, their eyes now turned toward the camera. The father's figure was missing, replaced by the faint outline of the cabin. In the lower corner, scratched into the paper, was a word that hadn't been there before. *stay. Clara's hands shook as she dropped the photograph. She ran to her car, desperate to leave Lecture Hollow behind, but as she reached the main road, her headlights caught something at the tree line, a figure standing still among the pines, tall and familiar, holding what looked like a lantern. For a second, the light revealed his face, pale and unblinking. It was Eli Caldwell, just as he'd looked in the photograph, smiling faintly as he raised a hand in greeting. Behind him, other shapes began to emerge from the trees, more figures, more faces, all watching. As Clara sped away, she realized the names on that cellar wall weren't a record of the dead. They were a promise. And somewhere among those trees, that promise was waiting for her to return.